Um, Delighted to welcome you to this afternoon. This will be our. We'll change into English mode now because I'm so delighted to be able to introduce to you Dr. Vicky Gunn from the University of Glasgow. She's director of the Centre for Learning and Teaching. Is that right? She's got a phenomenal, very exciting publications list that you can follow up. And she's been knocking about in the higher educational development sector since Tony Blair got into power in '97. And things could only get better, but they didn't. No. It's a great pleasure to have you here, and it will also add to this conference a more international perspective, which might throw some light on some of those critical questions that Åsa was asking earlier as well. So I will let you. We've got Vicky for an hour and a half, which won't be nearly enough, I'm sure. But I will hand over to you now. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you. If you're interested in the research base that this talk is on, I've brought the literature review, copies of the literature review. There probably aren't enough for everyone, but certainly I will skim over some of the more complex things or some of the more in detail things. But I thought you might like a copy of the hard copy, and then you can scroll all over it and decide whether or not you like the structure.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Put the microphone a bit closer to you now.
Yeah, sure. There, is that better? Oh, it's very strange. The trouble with these things is they make me think I'm a pop star. Okay, right. Okay, so I was commissioned to do a literature review on teaching excellence global perspectives a year ago, and the commissioning body didn't get quite what they expected. What they expected, I think, was a discourse analysis of the use of the word excellence. And in fact, this has been done so many times, and we know it can be a really fatuous word, that actually it can become so ubiquitous that it's meaningless. And at the first few meetings that I had with the commissioning body, which was the Higher Education Academy, I could see their panic because they didn't think I would be able to write something, because I kept saying, you're talking about teaching excellence and you're not talking about the changes that are occurring at the moment for academics. And all we do is we focus on teaching excellence at this high level without asking the question, what are academics being asked to do? Because some of what they're being asked to do will help in a conversation about excellence, and some of it will hinder in a conversation about excellence. Now, I have to say I was not so clear a year ago, so it came out like this: everything's changing, there's loads of things, we've got to fit it in. And so they were very funny about that. But the question that I said we had to start with was actually the one before the question of what is teaching excellence. And that question is, what are we supposed to be doing? What educationally are we supposed to be delivering? And who is saying what those things are? Because what we're supposed to be delivering educationally is the thing that is excellent or not excellent, if you're saying that teaching is excellent. And that's a slightly different question to the one that comes up in the literature, because the one that comes up in the literature is what makes for an excellent teacher? And these are different things, and they get obfuscated. So the first dimension of excellence that I suggested that we look at, and seemed to be coming through implicitly in the literature, was something about the broader demands on us in terms of education, and which ones academics were most comfortable with. And these are the four broad types of demand. So one educational demand is that our students achieve disciplinary mastery. Now, my background is in a discipline where disciplinary mastery has a very particular feel to it. It's an analysis of texts, potentially also with a knowledge of something called paleography, so their capacity to read manuscripts. It's very specific. is that if I get excellent outcomes, if my students do really well and perform intellectually really well and develop the craft of paleography, is that teaching excellence? Because if it is, it's not what the literature is talking about. So we'll come back to that. Or we're asked to ensure that students achieve a level of mastery in the discipline and appropriate levels of transferable development skills so that they can do things. So just to use my analogy again, that moves it from textual analysis and paleography, and then it moves it into how do they communicate those things in groups and individually. And how can they use the knowledge base that they've gained in my discipline and transfer intellectual principles into the broader world. What would count as excellence in that is a slightly different thing to what counts as excellence in the first one. Then there's the third demand, that they enter a fit for purpose into a profession. And of course the medical arena, the dentists, people with professional intended learning outcomes will tell you that it is not just disciplinary mastery. It is something more about the profession. And number 4 is the one that most educationalists identify with, that university education needs to provide students with an environment in which they develop an awareness of and an engagement with bigger global and local issues, socio-political ones, economic ones, cultural ones. Now, makes sense? Okay, but you have to add to this dimension the slightly more tricky thing about how we orient to each of those 4. And what I want to say to you is that most of us at different points in our career will orientate more to one or 2 of those and less to the others. But we tend not to deny them all completely. How we engage with them is what's different. Now that means that what you consider to be excellent teaching outcomes might change over the length of your career. And again, when we talk about teaching excellence in the literature, when you see it talked about in the literature, it's timeless, it's placeless, it's universal, it's a totalizing statement. It makes no sense. This is what happens if you add time and space to these 4 demands. Within the discipline, what you're looking at is delivering learning environment and encouraging the students to learn in a local environment that has a specific contextual situation. And some of our academics are excellent at this. They are qualitatively outstanding at doing that. That's what they are. For others, the discipline isn't enough. You've actually got to enable the students to translate from the space of the discipline to a broader space in their immediate context. There are some of our academics who are outstanding at this. For others, it's fit for practice. Now, this is tricky depending on the discipline, so that in itself adds another dimension. But the interesting thing about fit for practice is that this is about the future. So it's not just about responding to a student's immediate needs to know, it's about establishing something that the student will carry with them in their lives. Now, some academics don't believe we can do that. And they are not necessarily bad teachers. They just don't believe that we have the capacity to influence the students that much. Whereas other people think actually education is all about the future. And that group will tend to use phrases like future-proofing, which from my point of view is a little bit of a weird one to say. You can't proof against the future. And then I mentioned the one about educationalists tend to be in this cluster about the bigger global issues. And actually, they tend to be looking at how are we going to make global citizens? How are we going to make people who engage in peacemaking, in democracy, in making the world a better place, making the world a wealthier place, all of those things. Now, if you think about that, what you start to realise is that actually saying what teaching excellence is, even if you just take it down to the individual teacher, becomes really difficult. And that is the problem. Everything else is a little bit of an obfuscation. Until we accept that excellence is how well we meet educational demands at one level, it becomes almost, what do we mean? You know, my university it's going to be excellent in research, excellence in teaching, and it might also be quite good at the local community. And you think, well, yeah, and what does that mean? Because when you talk to discipline people, you'll find a mixture of these. Now, I was talking to a group of academics at Sheffield Hallam last week, and I asked them which ones they mostly identified with. Now, this is really interesting for me. They were all senior fellows of the HEA, and they said that for them, the two dominant orientations are the discipline and ways of being. And they felt that their colleagues in the disciplines would be very much up in that top quartile. That actually they're excellent at some of the things they do with the discipline, but they're not able to project. They're not interested in projecting forward, and they're not interested in projecting into other spaces. And that's why it's tricky, and this is why the HEA were really concerned, because they thought, if I'm saying this, I'm not going to help them do their thing, which is to come up with pragmatic, easy how to solve the problem literature. So basically, my feeling is that within any of these, within our being as a academic and clusters of academics, we have liminal leanings. And those leanings determine how we interact with teaching, and whether or not thus we would be determined as being part of an excellent teaching culture. And I'm trying my best to stay away at the moment from the words teacher excellence, because most of the literature is about teacher excellence. It's actually really hard to find quality higher education literature that's about this bigger thing, which is teaching excellence. This orientation for me is where our desires and our hopes lie, and it's a driver, it's a motivating force. And if we don't acknowledge that, if we try and write our orientation over another group's orientation, then somewhere we are perhaps blocking a motivating force, and we have to recognize that. And that makes our job as educational developers really difficult. It gets even harder if you read the thesis that I was examining yesterday, because even within the disciplines you get microcultures, and therefore you could have clusters of these in the discipline and go in thinking, right, this discipline has a tendency to do X, Y, and Z, and you end up in front of a microculture. Now this happens for me a lot with the life sciences, so I tend only to work with people in the life sciences who are interested in teaching. And if you try and talk about discipline, the discipline orientation of the people who do the honours programs in third and fourth year, they just say, no, they're bad teachers. And you're like, oh, wait a minute, how are you making that particular judgment? And let's just have a look at how that judgment works. So, on top of that, there are these three categories in excellence, which are very rarely articulated in the discourse around teaching excellence. There's teacher excellence, and most of us are bound up with that at the moment because universities are attempting to identify the criteria for promotion, and that is beginning to determine how we think of teacher excellence. And because we're sloppy, we tend to call it teaching excellence. And one of my pushes back is to say, don't get into that. Once you go into individual criteria, you're talking about the performance of an individual, and that in itself is contrary to the orientation of a lot of people who like teaching, because they like teaching because it's collaborative. So let's just remember that teaching excellence may well be collaborative, not individual. How are you going to allow those people to get promotion? So it's a huge one for me. Teaching excellence I'll come back to, but basically if you look at the document you'll see that there are national strategies that establish a particular culture, there are institutional strategies that attempt to establish a particular culture, and if these things aren't there, if the investment isn't there, then you would have to say, what is what is the culture in which somebody who's being excellent actually about? And what you find is that when those things aren't there, excellent teachers are heroic individuals. And there's a bit of a question as to whether or not heroic individuals are a sustainable way to go when it comes with excellence. Because it places a lot of responsibility on those individuals. And if they leave, something quite profound will be lost within the institution. Now, one of the things about this is I did not look at excellence in learning, and I didn't look at excellence in learning because in the years before 2007, the HEA had commissioned something which did look at excellence in learning. And they struggled with it, to be honest. They struggled to define what excellence in learning was. And that in itself is a demonstration of the fact that actually you've got to come to terms with the educational demands before you can say what excellence in learning is. You might be able to say that the best way to get to excellence in learning is through a particular set of pedagogic methods. But even that will be determined by which orientation the group, the clusters are really pushing towards. And the reason I started to do this is that I've been working with academic developers literally since 1997, and they're evangelists. And they'll quite often go in with their dominant orientation first, and if they're met, that's great. But if they're not met, then you get this tension between the academic developers who are attempting to manage change and the academics who think they are being told they're not good enough. And that issue and the guilt and shame that might actually be in there that we haven't really been able to really pull out in the literature yet, I think is a huge leadership issue. I think leadership requires us to hold our orientations in abeyance until we know what their orientations are. Because the distance to be moved is going to be greater for some than it is for others. And we've got limited resources. So if we go in and we immediately manage to say to a group of people, even if that's not what we've said, look, you're not doing it right, and they think they're meeting their educational demand and that their outcomes show that, then our position becomes vulnerable. And I think we also have to have at least one eye on our own survival some of the time. So these are actually the 4 dimensions that I would suggest make up the strength of teaching excellence. If you want to claim teaching excellence, these would be the sorts of things that you would need to unpick. How are you achieving educational demands? And how is that done within a program? Because, you know, a whole program does not need to be taught by people who all have the same orientation, but students need to know that. They need to know what strengths they're being, that are being modelled to them. But then what are the structures? So my real concern at the moment is this push towards individual reward and recognition, because that will determine excellence. And what it will mean is the mavericks may well find themselves getting promotion without actually it reflecting the fact that the first 2 years of the programme that they are getting promotion for is delivered entirely by a teaching team of university teachers. So the mavericks could pick up on the long-term investment that's been made in the first couple of years. And the teaching team in the first couple of years, because it doesn't have a research profile, just feels even less valued. So I have real concerns about this, and I'm being asked to write the criteria for teaching excellence at my own institution in collaboration with other academics, and getting the idea that we have to find a criteria that sums up effective membership of a collaboration is almost impossible. And then it comes to, what's the quality of evidence? Arguably, learning analytics will give us more evidence. And the quality of some of that will be really good, and the quality of some of it will be wrong. It will just end up being interpreted in the wrong way. On the whole, educational development has focused on reflective practice portfolios. The unfortunate thing about that is that most of the disciplines don't do reflective practice portfolios and think it's a social sciences imposition. And that in itself then generates a problem if you say that is quality evidence. Because there's an awful lot of people who don't think it is quality evidence, because they don't understand that meaning making is part of the evidence base in that way. And then there's this dimension of demonstrating individual excellence, and I'm gonna touch on this a bit. In the literature, these are the trends about demonstrating excellence. So it's dynamic engagement in terms of delivery, and it's dynamic engagement beyond delivery. I'll explain these. And it's growth as a teaching-oriented scholar. Now, for ease, I'm going to refer to the scholarship of teaching and learning as SOTL. Is that okay? Okay, right, that's fine. Because there's a reason for me wanting to talk about it as a identifiable cluster, and you'll see it in the latter part of the talk when I'm talking about status. The other thing is that this notion of dynamic engagement is actually very related to the intersubjective aspects of learning and teaching. It's almost how you are as a person with the students, rather than what ways of solving teaching problems do you use. So one of my concerns about learning analytics is that if you're a charismatic, you're probably going to average out at maybe 1 or 2 points on a grade point average higher than everyone else. Because in the experience of you, folk will feel more convinced, and because they feel more convinced, they're likely to think that you're more satisfying. And if the question is, how satisfied are you, then the charismatic is probably going to come out with a slightly better vote. So my first point about the evidence is we need to take a point off all the charismatics because they are skewing our data set. Okay? You can imagine how well that one goes down. But we are universities. Yes, we have a responsibility and a duty of care to our students, but we are also people who are generating new knowledge, and those people are not always charismatic, but quite often they have something worth listening to. So determining excellence on affective characteristics is really tricky for me. I find it disquieting. And I think we have to not only work with academics about what teaching excellence is, as opposed to just being a really, really exciting person, but we also have to teach students how they should not be convinced by energy. Inspired, yes. Convinced, no. These are two separate things. And the students quite often conflate them. Now, why am I saying this? Students will write down something I say in a lecture if I say it with enough energy. And you can do this. If you want to do it as a little bit of a joke with the students, you throw something into the middle of a lecture. So I do church history, so I could throw in, of course, they had to build the towers like that so that all of the monks could stand on each other's shoulders and someone could look out the top and see what was going on. And then you get it in an exam. It comes back to you in an exam, and that's when you know you're convincing them as well as perhaps inspiring them. And that's when I start to worry. But the thing that really worried me was I was asked, and this would have been in about 1998, to go and speak, observe a professor in law who taught a subject called obligations. It's a difficult subject, it's a conceptual subject. It's about the way that obligations in contracts work. He had the best teaching scores in the School of Law at the time. Everybody talked about him. 50% of the class failed. Every year, 50% failed. Now, the problem with this is obligations is a professional requirement if you want to go on and do the diploma in law. So this fail rate was a problem. So I thought, oh gosh, no, okay. This guy was about to become the next president of the Law Society in Scotland, okay. I was a junior lecturer. I hadn't even finished my PhD. And I went to watch him and I thought, wow, this guy is fabulous. This is the most entertaining 15 minutes I have ever seen. And then I went out, and the next day I tried to write down what I could remember of what he had said, even though I'd taken a few notes, and I couldn't. All I could remember was that he told a really good story about ownership of a pink poodle. But I couldn't, and that's all I can remember. I can still remember the pink poodle. And that's what was happening to the students. They were so enamoured of this guy's performance that they thought they understood it. They actually thought they understood it, and obligations is tough. Now, the interesting thing is I had to go and talk to him after this. Because that's how nice they are to educational developers. Have you ever noticed that? It's like, right, we'll send the educational developer in. And I said to him, look, you're brilliant. You're absolutely brilliant. But they don't get anything to take away that they can then revise from. And he said, no, it's just because obligations is so difficult. I was like, oh, no. So anyway, he went off to the Law Society and they brought in 2 introverts. I mean, I can't, you couldn't have got a different personality set of traits than what came in. And the pass rate went up. The pass rate went up to 75%. And what the introverts did was they recognised it was a tricky subject and they set problem-based tasks as well as the lectures to reinforce the concepts in the lectures. Bingo. Completely different situation. And that's when I started to think the way students judge teaching is problematic, and we must educate them to be able to make the right kinds of reflections on their teachers. That doesn't mean that being a nice person that's interested in the students isn't important. But it's recognising that sometimes you're going to learn more from the person who's not that interested in you, that you have to abstract more from. The other thing that really terrified me, actually, in the literature was it's a vocation for life. Excellence as a vocation for life. I just thought that was exhausting. And because your orientations can change in your academic career, I also thought it's unsustainable for some people. So how do we support the people when they're at their peak of enthusiasm, but allow them to accept that maybe in 10 years' time, when it comes to it and they get their first not-so-good student review, that they cope with that and that's okay because things change over time. These are the repeating dimensions in terms of teacher excellence, and this is where writing criteria for promotions becomes really tricky. Because folk who are vocationally oriented towards teaching are very comfortable in that top half, the planning and delivery and the assessment. But for promotion, they have to be strong in evaluating and reflecting in a way that goes beyond them, and that's a tricky one. And they have to contribute to the profession outside of the physical location of their own university. And that is another tricky one. Because if your energy is on your students in their location, why would you want to spend time on a train going to other places to disseminate that when actually your location is in that immediate space and your vocation is in that immediate space? So it's a problematic one. And the other problem is, what are the opportunities that you, if you are very oriented towards teaching, are actually going to get to fulfill that quartile? And that's the question universities are asking at the moment. These are, you'll recognise these, formal peer observation of teaching, formal POT. Somebody said, actually, somebody saw that and they assumed that I was talking about that. Now, if anyone can get, okay, so there's the plant and there's the, and I was like, no, these are different things. Peer observation of teaching, probably one of the most effective techniques that we have. Is it confidential or not? Now, for an educational developer, that's quite a big question. Because what if you go into a lecture and it's awful? And you give that person feedback, and then you go back the next year and they've done exactly the same thing. At what point should you can you say to a line manager, this is not good enough teaching? Would you want to? And that's a bigger question, because a lot of educational developers don't want to do that. But if formal peer observation of teaching becomes evidence, then we have to be honest in it. And that generates all sorts of issues about the public nature of that honesty and what it might do. Now, if I'm a senior manager, I'm going to say, ooh, what if the press get hold of that? So reputation management suddenly starts to play a role in what we're doing, and whether or not we can be honest. But if we can't be honest, how are we ever going to get anyone to really look at what they're doing in the classroom? Competence portfolios, for me, these are highly problematic, and it's because of the time they take. And it's how we can construct portfolios in such a way that they benefit the academic in their orientation at the time and maybe move them a bit. Because I don't think we should be about keeping them comfortable, but I don't either think we should be about shutting them down by making them think that we don't understand them. Evaluations. I've written recently on learning analytics. I write commentary for a group in the UK called the Society for Research into Higher Education. Learning analytics fascinate me. They absolutely fascinate me. They are an interesting way of understanding our students' behaviour. And we are going to have to learn how to manage the triangulation of that data with a lot of the qualitative data that we access as educational developers. There are huge questions about surveillance, huge. And nobody yet has come up with a way of addressing the fact that learning and analytics allow us to know what our students are doing, when, and sometimes how. Now, they don't just do it for the students, they do it for the academics too. So it's time for us to start saying, right, these are the limits of this data set. This is where we're going to use this data set. And one of the things that I've argued is we need to take learning analytics away from the reputation managers, because they are not going to use the data in a way that is useful to the ultimate aim of education, because they're going to have to protect the university from its weaknesses, or from those weaknesses going public. And then there's SOTL, and I am going to talk a little bit about SOTL, like I said, later on, because SOTL is both a positive and a danger. And I'll show you why in a minute. So, but we've got to get out there because we want promotion, we want to be valued, and if it's just the things that we're talking about, how does anyone know how good we are? That's a big question. How do you know how good you are? So, it might interest you to know that until 3 years ago, I did not travel. I was not particularly interested in the external reputation aspect of being an academic. It was not something that particularly bothered me. Okay, this is the story. Bernard of Clairvaux. Anybody know who Bernard of Clairvaux is? Okay, 12th century scholar, stayed in Clairvaux all his life, was one of the most transnational scholars of his time. Didn't go anywhere. And this was what I said to senior management group when they said, we need you to travel. I'd say, yeah, no, but Bernard of Clairvaux didn't, and look what he did. However, then they made me the interim director of the Learning and Teaching Centre, and the first thing that I was told is, you need to have an international profile. So I did 50,000 miles in a semester, and then I got back, and then they said, okay, can you stay at home now? I was like, right, okay, fine. The thing is, we have got to get out there because technology is not yet able to do what we need it to do. I mean, I'd love to do more, but I'd like to be able to do it in my study through technology, but we're not there yet. And a lot of people don't like it. They want to meet you. They want to have that time. And I'm not saying that's wrong. It's just that there are limits to what individuals can do if actually disseminating externally to their institution is something they're being asked to do. Then there's a dissemination within our institutions, which is really problematic. Now, I said that teaching excellence in the dimensions has this institutional aspect. The structures of enablement in the institution need to be there in relationship to this for dissemination to work. Otherwise, you get teaching champions, and the responsibility for teaching in areas becomes located around those people, and the researchers go, oh, that's fine, that's his thing. Well, that's her thing, they do that. And what you get is actually, in terms of impact, a decrease in teaching quality, because it's located around an individual rather than part of the culture. And that's really tricky, because on the one hand you want to promote champions, you want them to know how special they are, and on the other hand you have to kind of work against the possibility that that will allow some people not to take their responsibility for the whole culture. Impact, knowledge transfer will come on to, esteem will come on to. Now, I don't know how much you know about what's going on in the UK, and to a certain extent what's gone on in Australia, and I think has gone on in at least the research intensives here. But contracts are being differentiated. Academic contracts are being differentiated. So pathways through an academic career are more than this sense that you're an academic that goes through a career. You might be a researcher, you might be research teaching, or you might be a university teacher. And what impact and esteem mean for those different categories is not the same. But the criteria that are being used are quite often imported in from the researcher and teacher track. And we need to work on that. We actually need to work on what it means to develop esteem in a track where you can't depend on international publication. So this is a big issue. Okay. So this is your task while you're here. You have got to come up with a taxonomy that has variation in terms of quality in it and represents what threshold and excellence would be in terms of each of those educational demands. Because until we've got that one nailed, it becomes really difficult to work out what a university mission statement that has teaching excellence in it means. And it's really hard. It's actually really difficult, because the indicators for excellence are not clear, because they're contextual. Now, what we've tended to do in the literature is say not only are they contextual, but it is a neoliberal negative to attempt to identify them. That may be the case, but if we don't, someone else will. If we don't actually begin to work on this, then someone else will impose a system or a taxonomy with a hierarchy in it that is maybe not appropriate. And that's a real problem. It's fascinating. There are things in the literature where someone says this was really excellent, it really helped the students and it did X, Y and Z, but of course it's just part of neoliberalism. Negative. And you're like, okay, all right, okay, so we're in these big structures and we're attempting to challenge those structures, but we also need to recognise that there are things that we can do that are of benefit, and we can't, we need to engage cleverly with this. But then we also have to identify how well an institution, a discipline, and an individual academic informs, demonstrates, and judges the variation. It's what academics do all the time, but isn't it interesting that when it comes to something like teaching, they fall back on really, really simplistic qualitative judgments? And you're like, oh, come on, we can do better than this. The other thing that we've got to do is it has to go with career profile and where you're at, which level of the hierarchy in terms of your career progression you're at. Now, it might interest you to know that although research suggests professors have a sense that teaching excellence is something they should be engaged in, there is no sense amongst professors that they should be leaders of teaching excellence, except some of the professors who've been appointed on learning and teaching track professorial positions. But even then, they don't think they have a community responsibility. They think they have a disciplinary responsibility. So how do we change that? Should we change that? Is it okay to be a professor and be a really crap teacher? Because it's a significant question. It goes down really well at my institution. I'm like, ooh. And at my institution, a bad teacher who's a good professor, they take all of those responsibilities away from them and they give them to a junior member of staff. Which means that that junior member of staff has then got 2 more ladders to climb because they've had their workload amended. Now this is an injustice. And yet, how do we stop it, is my question. So, which brings me on to status and teaching orientations. Now, the context we're in is this formal diversification of academic roles, and it is being formalised in the UK. And it is, I don't like it, I can see why it's happening, and if we can be seen as different and equal, it will be of benefit. But if the resource base shifts, then rather than different but equal, you will get different and lesser and greater. And that's the issue, that we will be fighting over a resource that's decreasing, and certain people will emerge as the beneficiaries of what's left, with the rest of us doing the other stuff. Now that may just be the way it works when resources go. Then the real question then is, how do we value ourselves if the structures aren't there to value us? What I want to suggest, this is me beginning to work on something now, so you can come back and say, no, it's not like that, that's not how it's worked. But what I would suggest is that as our universities have expanded, the informal status processes that we have depended on are problematic. Now, what does this mean? Okay, so an informal status process acts on deference. So how do I defer to somebody who I respect? Because as I defer, I confer something onto them and their status goes up. Now, if you have a collegial system, this process of deference really plays out. The argument is, does it allow for more social mobility? So at what point do I do something that means that people in my group start deferring to me and I start to become the status indicator? And this, Thomas, ties a bit into Thomas's work on these microcultures with the hubs. Okay, because the hubs are people who, for what reason, are being preferred, or their status is being conferred on them by their group. Now, that is an informal status indicator, and how you measure it is really difficult. You know, though, when you go into a senior manager as an educational developer, and they have the top physics researcher in the country in that room complaining about your program, what it feels like. Because that senior manager looks at the physics person and more or less gives them what they want and hopes you keep your mouth shut. This is a process of deference. That is the senior manager deferring to the physics lecturer, and because they have a status position, and it underpins collegiality. Now the real question is, from a feminist perspective, okay, it's a problem, and we have to look at it. But the argument is that in those collegial systems, the possibility for social mobility is better. That actually, by doing something quite unusual, you suddenly change and your social status within that cluster changes. Because of the sheer scale of our universities now, we're bringing structures in to manage organisations which have gone beyond an optimal point, arguably, for implicit social status management. Now that would be an argument. I'm not saying it's right, but that would be an argument. And what we're doing is we're differentiating groups, and in that we are differentiating their status and we're concretising it. So you bring in your 3 or 4 career tracks and you say to people, there's flexibility across the tracks. But the reality is, only if you're going to have access to the opportunities that allow for it. And a couple of those tracks will be discriminated against in terms of those opportunities, which fixes the inequality. Now, in the long term, this may actually lead to less conflict because people will know their place in the hierarchy. But the real question is, does it generate innovation? Because the argument would be no, it closes it down, except for a very small elite group. And this is when you start thinking, blimey, teaching excellence is really difficult. What the hell are we meaning? But I'm really worried about status mobility, and I think the future for educational development is to work out how we can become people who enable status mobility so that folk recognise this. Now, SOTL. SOTL worries me, and it worries me for these 3 reasons. As something that has almost come from within and upwards, it's great. And it's fabulous, actually. And when you meet other people involved in the scholarship of teaching and learning, there's a real sense of affinity. So I am not saying that I agree with these things. I just want to point them out. The way that non-SOTL people in research talk about SOTL tends to be in one of 3 clusters. Firstly, it's bad research. They might not say it like that. What they'll say is, well, if it doesn't get into a 3 or a 4-star journal, we don't really want publications in 1 and 2 journals. And what are 1 and 2-star journals? They're local practical journals. That's what they are. They are the heart of SOTL. So you go into a room and you think, oh, right, so what does that mean? That means that to get anywhere, I've got to compete with people who are on researcher contracts and get myself into a 3 and 4-star journal. A tip, if that's you, do it now, particularly if it's in English, because we've just had a ref census, and it means that submissions to journal publications for this year coming, a lot lower, because they don't always count, so get them in now, is what I would say to you. But the point is, practical-based research is valued at a lower level in a taxonomy. Your medical educators know it, your lawyer, clinical, legal educators know it, and we know it. So how do we manage that status differentiation? Or it's seen as the servant to research. What we really need is to get all of our SOTL people together and get them to work with one of our high researchers so that we can have an impact bit of the high research that is drawn from the SOTL. Now, I know I can see you shaking your head, but impact agendas get read that way. So this piece of work, if it has an impact over the next 5 years, if somebody goes and gets an ESRC grant on teaching excellence, which is about to come because teaching excellence in higher education looks like it's going to be a theme, then they might phone me up and say, we need some impact. And suddenly I become a service to the people who are going to get the research money. Now, this may not have happened to you, okay? But be aware that that's a trend that is potential. Now, as a senior manager who's on an R&T contract, there's a bit of me doesn't have a problem with that, as long as the folk are given the value that they offer, as long as they are respected for what it is that they do and not seen as the secondary citizens who do, they do impact, or they do practice base. And the other thing about me, which has been difficult, I think, for the academic developers who know me in Scotland, is that I work to my institution's agenda. The research that I have done over the last 3 years has almost entirely been tied in to the learning and teaching strategy agenda. I've chased money, but it's been for their agenda. I haven't done autonomous academic work in the last 3 years. Because for me, the focus has been managing impact through the agendas. Now, some of you will be comfortable with that, some of you won't. But there is a push for the impact of SOTL to be tied to learning and teaching strategies. And that will change the nature of what academic developers are able and not able to do in their working day. I mean, I'm quite lucky because I do wacky stuff with whatever I have to do. So I always write something that's very strategic from it, and then I write something that's very academic from it. But that's not what everyone's strengths are. So you have to work this out quite carefully. So, there are increasing questions about SOTL, okay, and it's just to be aware that there are status questions about it as well. What's emerging in practice? Okay, well, where differentiated contracts are coming in, and if you know Lars Geschwind, his stuff on this is really good too, so you maybe want to have him come and talk to you as well, because it gives you the Swedish context much more closely, but actually it's a pattern that's emerging all over the place. So there are pragmatic demands in undergraduate programs in terms of delivery and assessment. And there are pragmatic demands for elite researchers and those on research teaching contracts that do not necessarily fit well together. So the pragmatic demands in teaching tend to get shifted from the R&T and R track to the university teacher track. That protects the R&T staff, allows them to meet their criteria, but it means that the UT track don't get the time to do the contribution to the profession that's necessary for them to get promotion. And that's a problem that I have in my institution. It's something we're working on at the moment. How do we ensure that they aren't just teaching assistants? Because a lot of the researchers think that's what we mean. Now that means you have to start introducing modelling systems. And we don't know how successful they are. Then you get money to recruit a new member of staff. You're in the run-up to a research excellence period. And rather than appointing a university teacher, let's just say a university teacher has left, but you get money for a R&T or a UT, what do? You probably appoint an R&T, which means the workload of the original university teacher that's left has to be shared out. And that is another thing that's beginning to happen. And again, it leaves the UT in a position where they can't necessarily get promotion. Okay? Then, nobody's picked this up. Okay, there are a fixed number of opportunities for taking leadership in teaching. Program leaders, course leaders, QA leaders. Who is getting those roles? Because if the criteria say that an R&T track academic needs access to those roles to get promotion, then interestingly, they'll probably get first call on those roles. Now this is where you start to see, okay, so we've moved from this informal status deference into something that's a little bit more pragmatic and practical. I'm not sure that it is true, actually. I think, but that's the perception, and I think we need the data now. We need to actually look at the data. And then there's this whole collaborative problem solving in teaching teams. Now, a colleague of mine in psychology said, "What does excellence mean in this situation?" We're a week before term starts, and the recruitment office tells us they have over-recruited by 250 students. All of our room bookings are wrong because we had assessed on a previous number. We don't have enough teaching staff to cover that extra 250. They haven't actually got accommodation, so that's another issue altogether because they don't know where they're sleeping. And yet, we have to make sure, because it will be first years, that they have the best possible first year experience. Now, what that teaching team does is it comes together and it puts a structure in to cope with that potential crisis, and it turns it around. And having come up with a structure for turning it around and responding, the next year the same thing happens and it does it, but nobody says that's excellent anymore because the excellent was the year before. Now it's just normal. Now, that all sounds a bit funny until you realise that these folk are getting criteria for excellence in terms of P&DI, in terms of appraisal. So they're excellent one year, normal the next year. For a pay rise, you need excellence over 2 years. Okay? It's a good question. It's a really, really good question. And this is where, I mean, you're probably thinking, yes, but educational development is about encouraging the students to learn. Yes, it is. But if the academics are struggling with these things, your message is going to take an awful lot longer to get through. And actually, it isn't just, it's not just about the students, it's also about the academics. So, I haven't got an answer for you. We are working on it at Glasgow at the moment because I'm noisy enough to say that's an injustice. I'm also pragmatic enough to know that our top researchers, the elite group, will get what they want. Most of them are almost being employed by themselves anyway because of the money they bring in. They're going to get what they want. The real issue is, how do I make sure that what they want doesn't become the norm for everyone else? Because that's where the tension really lies. Now, the first one is making sure that you can demonstrate when the injustices that I've just pointed out are happening in reality as opposed to perception. Because one of the problems for teaching-oriented staff is that they have a perception of being lower status when compared with R&T and R. Perception and reality are not necessarily exclusive, but we should not give up our sense of self because we're not like the other guys over there. So, and people like me who are in leadership positions need to identify the opportunities to enable folk to prove that they are worthy of promotion. Now, this means that heads of school or heads of faculty have to take this responsibility on and stop deflecting it, which is what they quite often do. And that changes the nature of headship, which means that leadership becomes even more important. Our appraisal form at Glasgow is a singular appraisal form designed for the R&T track. So if you're on university teacher track, the first 4 pages don't relate to you. Is it really so difficult for our human resources to take that 4 pages out and put in something that looks like a university teacher? The first thing they get is, how much money and research have you brought in? How many publications have you had for the next REF? What are your esteem factors? And then they get 250 words on teaching. What does it say? Symbolically it says, you're over there. You're just... So these things, the fact that academics won't get symbolic value is just. So, this is my argument. Universities are strong because they are fruit salad. Okay? The taste comes from the mixing of the fruit, not the individual fruit of its own self. And if we compare apples and pears and bananas, we cannot actually see our own worth, because one of those fruits comes out as better depending on who you are. So I really like bananas. Okay, so bananas are the best thing in a fruit salad. Actually, no, a fruit salad's great because of the mix of flavours. And one of the things I'm going to try and push at Glasgow is truly differentiated criteria for teaching excellence. That is not just R&T versions of it. But that isn't necessarily going to be enough, because there are status issues that we need to address and recognise if we're going to move on. Okay, so I wanted to leave you with a picture of fruit. So you've had the Leaning Tower of Pisa and a fruit salad. That's my view on university teaching excellence. Here you go. Thank you very much for listening.